Well, my father actually was a real sort of pioneer in television through making television commercials. So in the 1970s, he was actually running creative for Y&R, Young and Rubicon. So if you watch Mad Men, that is essentially, that was my dad. As an African American at the time, he was the only one out there who had major accounts actually running in the television commercials, doing major print campaigns, etc. So we kind of grew up around design and around media. Milton Glaser, who designed the Brooklyn Brewery logo, his books, his graphic design books were coffee table books in my house. So visual arts was definitely something that we grew up with. When I went into school, I wasn't sure certainly that I wanted to follow that, but I was stage managing bands, I was doing all sorts of things when I was there, and I certainly thought I wanted to get into film. As opposed to advertising. But as I was coming out of school, I was looking at it, I'm like, well, I realized that my degree in broadcasting and film qualified me to drive any colored cab that I wanted, so I came up with an idea that since I had spent all my parents' money, it would be better if I was going to be unemployed that they did not see me, so I left the country. So that they wouldn't see me anymore, and they could say, oh, Garrett's gone to England, don't you know? He's very important over there. He's got so much to do. So I vanished, and I spent a year in London, and I was stage managing bands over there, but at the same time, I was going to the pub. And at the pub there, they had a form of beer which I'd never even heard of before, which is called cask conditioned beer. It's what Americans tend to think of as warm and flat, but in fact, it's just lightly carbonated. It's naturally carbonated. It's served warmer, but not warm, and it's got tons of flavor to it. So I drank beer when I was in college. We were college students. We drank everything we could and wherever we could find it as cheaply as possible. But there wasn't really any beer in the United States that was worth drinking. It had been turned into this sort of fizzy yellow water, which is still what most Americans are used to. But, especially in the United States, we had 4,000 breweries back in 1900. They made every kind of beer from all over the world. Here in Brooklyn, we had 48 breweries. They made 10% of all the beer in the United States in 1900. So just like our food community, our beer community was the most vibrant in the world because we're a nation of immigrants. We had brought everybody here. We had spoken their languages. We ate their food. We brewed their beer, and we did everything. And over 30 or 40 years, from say the 40s through the 60s, just like with food, we lost everything. Everything. We used to have all the great kinds of bread. Now we had one kind of bread. We used to have all these nice types of cheese. Now we have one kind of cheese, or maybe two. Kraft slices and Cracker Barrel. And that was pretty much it. If you were in an Italian neighborhood, maybe you got some mozzarella, and that was about it. So this re-establishment that you see of all this food coming back, craft beer is part of that. And I kind of fell in love with it living in England, then traveling around Europe, and I got back in 1984, and I was like, well, where's ours? I mean, we still had the fizzy yellow liquid. I had all this wonderful stuff, and I was like, okay, I can't drink this stuff anymore. And my best friend got me a homebrewing kit for Christmas so I could stop complaining and make my own beer, if the stuff here was so bad. And so I did. And I started to enjoy it. I started to get good at it. And in 1989, I actually decided to leave a pretty cushy job and go work for a brewery called Manhattan Brewing Company that was in Soho at the time. Yeah, well, I mean, I think society learned to brew beer from Africa, everywhere. It got refined going into the Middle East, into Egypt, into Samaria, and then moved from there, through Greece. When Greece took over Egypt, and then Rome took over Egypt, beer then moved with that up into the rest of Europe. Now, there may have been independently people figuring out how to make beer along the way. But in a lot of sub-Saharan African villages, brewing is still communal, and people still, the village elders will sit around, they'll have a bunch of long straws, just like a hookah, and they'll sit around drinking beer. I've drunk beer communally in huts, in townships in South Africa. I mean, every African community, it was like you had a central place that you might have a hearth, where everybody made their own dough, but they brought it to a central oven. and you always had a brewery, and it was part of everyday domestic life. Well, I came to Brooklyn Brewery in 1994, and I'd known the founders of Brooklyn Brewery for a long time, Steve Hindy and Tom Potter. We'd both been on the home brewing scene. They'd gone into brewing earlier than I did, 88 into 89, so maybe a year before I did. But at the time, all the brewing was being done north of the city, up in Utica. So they're really, even though we wanted to work together and we liked each other, I was brewing every day down at Manhattan Brewing Company, and they were still doing their thing up there and building the brand down here. When it came time for them to actually build the brewery here in Brooklyn, they got in touch with me and said, well, come on over here. I had other plans at the time, but eventually they convinced me something about a boat that I was going to get. I don't know, I still don't have this boat, you know, but they convinced me to come over here. And I actually brought my business partners that I was going to go into business with, brought them into Brooklyn Brewery, you know, and joined as brewmaster and partner in '94, and then set about building this shortly thereafter.